Hi again, everyone. So this is Rebecca Landy from the U.S. Human Rights Network. And give a note to our presenters to please mute your line when you're not presenting. We can hear you typing. So thank you, everyone, for joining. And this call is being recorded. And this is Engaging the Procedural Periodic Review, Steps for Writing and Submitting a Stakeholder Report. So just to give you a little bit of...
Entry and exit chimes are off.
Just to give you a bit of background information about the U.S. Human Rights Network, in case you're new to us, the U.S. Human Rights Network is a national network of organizations and individuals working to strengthen and grow a human rights movement and culture in the United States. Led by the people most directly impacted by human rights violations, it's a people-centered movement. And today, our presenters are myself, Rebecca Landy. I'm the Human Rights Outreach Coordinator at the network. Our first presenter is Amy Berkowitz from the Advocates for Human Rights and Kate Yamato from the Sex Workers Outreach Project. And both Amy and Kate are on our UPR task force. And then our final speaker will be Joshua Cooper from the Four Freedoms Forum. So we're going to go right ahead and get started. Amy and Kate, thank you so much for presenting today. And Amy and Kate will be talking about writing a stakeholder report for the Universal Periodic Review.
Welcome to any meeting. The meeting is listen-only.
So Amy and Kate, please go ahead and get started. Thank you so much. Amy and Kate, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Okay, sorry everyone for the technical difficulties. Hold on one moment.
This is Amy. I just called in. I apologize for the delay. I was having problems hearing the audio online.
Sorry, no problem. And it looks like Kate is muted, and I'm trying to unmute her right now. Oh, okay. Perhaps, Kate, you're logged into the system. Okay, twice. Okay, you're unmuted now. So, Kate, can you hear us? Are you able to speak?
Yep, I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yes, great. Okay, so thank you again, Amy and Kate, so much for presenting today. And go ahead and get started.
Okay. So if we're ready to get started, we're going to take you all through the 10 steps to writing a stakeholder report for the Universal Periodic Review. And Kate, let's verify. Have you ever written a stakeholder report for the Universal Periodic Review before?
No, I've never written a report before. I've done some support around gathering information, but I've never actually written one.
Okay, so for all of you who haven't written a stakeholder report before, we're just going to talk. Kate and I are going to talk through the process so that you can start thinking about what you're going to do as well. And the UPR is meant to be very accessible. It's meant to be something that anyone can participate in. So we'll jump right in, and let's move on to the next slide. First, some background about the Universal Periodic Review. There is what they call a working group on the Universal Periodic Review, which is the 47 member states of the Human Rights Council. There's regional representation. They have 3-year terms. And what's relevant to all of you is that all United Nations member states, which is basically every country in the world, may participate in what they call the interactive dialogue, the questions and answers between the government that's being reviewed and the rest of the United Nations. Unlike the treaty body processes, where you have a treaty body that consists of independent experts who are generally professors who actually specialize in human rights, in the Universal Periodic Review, it's a state-driven process. It's driven by the different governments, and it's the diplomats who represent those governments who are the ones making the recommendations. So it's a little bit different dynamic because it's a peer-to-peer review setup. And then another thing that's different about the UPR is that the country that's being reviewed gets to give thumbs up or thumbs down to each of the recommendations it receives. So they can accept recommendations or they can reject them. And you don't get to do that with a treaty body review process, but with this peer-to-peer review process, the Universal Periodic Review, the government that's being reviewed can accept or reject recommendations that are made by the other member states of the United Nations. Let's move on to the next slide. For NGO advocacy, or advocacy by civil society, there's an opportunity to submit UPR stakeholder reports. So NGOs, other organizations can submit stakeholder reports to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They typically do 8 to 10 months before this interactive dialogue happens. And another thing that's different compared with the treaty body review process is that the state reports, where the government reports on itself, they're due later in the process. They're due 12 weeks before that interactive dialogue takes place. So there's really no opportunity to shadow what the state report is because we don't know what the state report is going to say. We can certainly guess based on what the United States government has said for its treaty body review process, but there's technically not a shadowing function where first the state presents its glossy view of how it's doing on its human rights record, and then civil society responds. It's sort of a flipped process. Now, for stakeholder reports, you might ask, who are stakeholders? And that list there up on the slide that you see tells you who the United Nations considers to be stakeholders. Another function of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or OHCHR, is they take all of the stakeholder reports that are submitted for a particular UPR of a country, and they summarize them in a 10-page report. So that's a summary of all of the stakeholder reports, and in talking with the OHCHR staff, they are required to reference every single stakeholder report at least once in their compilation. And you can imagine if they're getting hundreds and hundreds of reports, that can be quite a task. So it's a 10-page, but it can seem brutally cursory when they're summarizing because they may just have a lot of different things to compile into one 10-page report. Another important part of the UPR process is that NGOs, or civil society organizations, can engage in electronic and in-person advocacy with the delegates, with the diplomats from all the other UN countries before that interactive dialogue happens to call for their attention to specific issues. So for those of you who engage in advocacy here in the United States, this would be sort of the lobbying piece of your advocacy, and there's a lot of lobbying to be done in the UPR. So let's move on to the next slide. If you want to look at examples of stakeholder reports, some people find that helpful. This is the main web page for the Universal Periodic Review. And over on the right-hand side, there's a link called Documentation Search by Country. So you can click that link and then pick any country. You can pick the United States, but then you're going to be looking at stakeholder reports that are 4.5, 5 years old. Or you can pick a country that was reviewed more recently to see what the second generation of stakeholder reports look like. Also relevant is what's in a red box in the lower right of the page, and that's a link for NGOs and NHRIs, and that's the main information web page for civil society groups that are considering submitting stakeholder reports. Let's go on to the next slide. If you click that documentation search by country, then there's a drop-down list of all the countries in the world, and you can choose the United States or you can choose another country. And then when you click on that link, you'll go to the next page. So let's go to the next slide. And you get a page like this. And if you want to see what the stakeholder reports look like, there's first in that red box is the summary of stakeholders' information. That's that 10-page document. Or if you click that superscript number 3, you'll get to a page that has links to all of the stakeholder reports submitted. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see what you get when you click that little 3. And this is just part of the page, but this is for the last UPR for the United States, all of the different stakeholder reports that were submitted. And you can go and peruse them to your heart's content if you so desire. And it works the same way for all the other country pages. So let's move on. So now we'll get into writing a stakeholder report. We're going to talk about the 10 steps to writing a stakeholder report. First is steps 1 through 4, setting the stage. Steps 5 through 7, planning and gathering information. And then implementation is steps 8 through 10. We'll talk a little bit about best practices and things to avoid, and then we'll move on, and we want to give you a chance to ask questions. So let's jump in. what I call step 0 is knowing what the rules are. And we've seen the screenshot before, and if you click the link in the lower right-hand corner, you'll get to the rule page for civil society submitting stakeholder reports. So let's go on to the next slide. And this is what you get to. And as I have in red boxes there, stakeholders should follow the technical guidelines for stakeholder submissions, so you can click that link to get more information. And also in the next red box, the stakeholder submissions should be sent through the new online UPR submission system. You have to upload your stakeholder report online. You have to register your organization. It's a very simple process, but you have to get things uploaded. And then lower down on this page is a list of all the deadlines for the stakeholder reports. And we all know that the U.S. stakeholder reports are due September 15th. So let's go on to the next page. Knowing the rules, if you click on that link for the guidelines, you'll find that individual reports, if it's just one organization, you have a word limit of 2,815 words, which is really short. It's about 5 pages. If it's a coalition report of 2 or more organizations, then you get double the words. The word limits don't include the footnotes or endnotes, but also when the OHCHR staff are compiling the summary document, they won't read your footnotes or endnotes, so bear that in mind. And you should number your paragraphs and number your pages and submit it as a Word document, use their online submission system, and the next deadline is September 15th for the United States, along with all of those other countries. And for uploading online, the deadline is going to be 11:59 p.m. Geneva time. So do your Google, what time is it in Geneva, and compare it to where you are to make sure that you are uploading it on time on September 15th or earlier. Let's move on. More about knowing the rules. Joint submissions are encouraged, especially if you have a lot of different groups. First-hand information is given priority. Second-hand information, and this is what they say in the rules, but of course you can certainly include second-hand information or secondary sources in your main text, but they say in the rules, put it only in footnotes or endnotes and only if necessary. They want you to focus in your report on implementation of accepted recommendations and developments since the last review, so developments since 2010. So looking through the recommendations that the U.S. government accepted or accepted in part, you want to look at whether they were, how they were implemented or how they were not implemented, and then what's happened on the ground since the last review that maybe we didn't have the opportunity to talk about in 2010. Stakeholders are encouraged to submit reports that contain credible and reliable information to highlight main issues of concern and then identify possible recommendations and best practices. So you really want to focus in on what those recommendations are. Go on to the next slide. Step 1, and this is where we get Kate involved, is to identify your expertise. So think about who you are and the group you work with. And first of all, Kate, tell us about your organization and what the issues are that your organization is involved with. Kate, are you there?
Yes.
So, Kate, tell us about your group and what your issues are.
This is Ann Fagan Ginger of Meiklejohn Civil Liberties Institute. And we work on all kinds of issues, and at the moment we're putting out a book, Our 100 Human Rights and How to Get Them Enforced.
Ann, let me interrupt you there. I'm meaning to be presenting with Kate D'Adamo, and so I'm doing this walkthrough with her, and it looks like she is muted and difficulty being heard. So let's see if we can get Kate to chime in here, and maybe some people from the U.S. Human Rights Network can help out as well.
Kate is saying that she's muted, and so maybe if someone from the network could try unmuting her from their end.
all lowercase.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties. This is Rebecca Landy from the U.S. Human Rights Network. I hope everyone has still stayed on. Kate, I'm going to try to unmute you right now. But if I can't unmute you, Kate, is it possible for you to call in? So Kate is going to hopefully call in, and thank you, everyone. Please bear with us for a moment as we try to sort this out. Amy, are you still there and able to talk? I'm wondering if you might be able to start off while we hopefully get Kate back on.
Sure, I'll get started, and then hopefully Kate will interrupt so that we know that she's on. And are you there, Kate?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you, Kate.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm Kate, and I work with the Stakeholder Outreach Project here in New York City. And we are a community-based grassroots organization that's working to improve the lives of people impacted by the sex trade, both on and off the job.
Great. And tell me, Kate, what are your advocacy goals for the UPR? What would you hope to accomplish coming out of this process?
We were able to have a recommendation in the UPR 5 years ago, Recommendation 86, which talked about ending violence against people in the sex trade. And it was really exciting just to have that acknowledged in the population, let alone to be able to get the government to accept the recommendation. And so this time around, 5 years later, unfortunately, especially when it comes to violence, and violence unfortunately perpetrated through government institutions and law enforcement, things have really gotten worse around the issue of violence. And so for this process, we're hoping to both reaffirm the commitment to ending violence against people in the sex trade, but hopefully make it a little more specific as to violence perpetrated against people in the sex trade by different government institutions, things like mass incarceration and policing.
Okay, so your focus is violence perpetrated against people in the sex trade, and here you're hoping to highlight government initiated violence. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and the ways in which being a criminalized population can really marginalize folks and make them a target population as well. So really kind of making violence against people in the sex trade more specific in terms of what we're dealing with and how we're going to address that.
Okay, great. So let's talk about what your resources are. Who do you have either in your organization or allied organizations who can help with putting together a stakeholder report, and what can they do?
Right now, I'm with the Sex Workers Outreach Project, but we're actually working with two other allied organizations, the Best Practices Policy Project and the Desiree Alliance. And we've all been working together and going through our networks to, right now we're kind of calling all of our information and trying to put together a stakeholder report. And so luckily we have people who have written stakeholder reports before, and we have a number of people who worked on the last UPR stakeholder report.
That's great. And if you're listening and you're not in that situation, don't worry. If you don't have people who have done UPR stakeholder reports before, it's still meant to be very accessible. And so don't be intimidated by Kate saying she has all these people on board. She's very fortunate, but you'll still be able to participate regardless. So let's move on to the next slide. And step 2 is identifying allies. And Kate, I think you already talked about allied organizations And you may also want to think about whether there are subject matter experts you could get involved, and think about how you want to enlist those allies. You could collaborate on a joint stakeholder report, which has the added bonus of getting you an extra 5 pages or so for your report. And you could also have organizations sign on. Once you have a draft of your report ready, circulate it to get sign-on. So those are 2 different ways for allied organizations to get involved. And you may want to think about other allies. Are there other networks, research institutions who can provide you with information or tactical tips? For example, the U.S. Human Rights Network might have some information or useful webinars for how to participate in the UPR process. And another thing to think about is there's power in numbers. So having more organizations signing on to the same report can add force to your advocacy when you're doing that lobbying with those diplomats, saying it's not just your group, it's your group plus this broader coalition. So Kate, talk to me a little bit more about allied organizations and other allies that you'd want to get involved with the UPR process.
Sure. Right now, like I said, we're working with 2 other allied organizations, and both of those are organizations that are constituent-led and really focus on people in the sex trade. And so through that, we're able to reach out to a lot of different organizations that work with folks in the sex trade, both directly and organizations that really look at that population under a larger umbrella population. So we're able to reach out to, not just people doing direct outreach under things like harm reduction, but we're also reaching out to trans-identified organizations, youth organizations, to be able to talk about this population specifically, especially because a lot of times this is a population that doesn't necessarily get picked out for other treaty bodies and other reports like that, or aren't centralized. And so it's been a way for organizations to talk about this population specifically, which has often a very unique set of needs and experiences violence in a very unique way.
Great. Let's move on to step 3. Next slide. And the next step, if you've already participated in the treaty body process, you'll know this already, but if you're new to the entire UN human rights advocacy process, you'll need to do a little bit of work at this step, and that's to identify the rights. How do you talk in human rights terms about the issues that you want to address? So it might be helpful to look through treaty language, looking at specific articles. Also very useful in most treaties, Article 2 is a non-discrimination provision, so that can implicate a lot of different advocacy issues. You can also look at general comments that treaty bodies issue, and you can look at treaty bodies' concluding observations to the state under review. I know we're eagerly awaiting the third committee's concluding observations from its review last week of the United States, but looking at other concluding observations for the United States. And one thing that's great about the UPR is that treaties the United States has not ratified are fair game. So you can look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child. You can look at all these other treaties, even if we haven't ratified them. It's perfectly fair game to talk about them in a UPR stakeholder report. It's meant to be universal, and that means it covers all of the rights, regardless of whether a particular government has ratified a particular treaty. So, Kate, have you done any thinking about how the issue of violence against people in the sex trade would be, how you would express your issues in terms of human rights?
Pardon. We have, and sorry, I apologize for the because of the 2 ways that I'm speaking, I'm getting a weird echo. And so we talked about it last time under a number of different rights. We talked about it in terms of access to housing, freedom of violence, stigma and discrimination, and fair. And I'll say right now, I don't have a human rights legal background, and so it's a language I definitely have trouble with, which is why this is so helpful. But we talk about it in terms of discrimination, freedom of violence, and equal protection under the law.
Yeah, that's great. And you don't have to get too deep in the weeds in terms of scrutinizing the treaty language. Freedom from violence and bodily integrity and personal security, those are all human rights terms. So, and you can also talk about it depending on the degree of the violence. You can talk about protection against torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment as well. That would also be relevant treaty language that you could use. And it's really just thinking about how you're going to frame your issues and arguments in a human rights context. So that's great. Let's move on to step 4. Step 4 is reviewing the procedural history, and Kate has already done her homework. But if you're listening and you haven't, don't worry. It's not too complicated. You want to read up on what happened in the last UPR with respect to the rights that you're focusing on. So you'd look at the report of the working group, which lists verbatim all of the recommendations that were made to the United States. And then look at the addendum, which is the United States government's response. Remember, I said each government gets to give the thumbs up or thumbs down to each of the recommendations. And the addendum is that document where the U.S. government says, we accept this recommendation, we accept this one in part, we don't accept this one, and sometimes there are some helpful explanations there. So, Kate, you said there was already a recommendation from the last UPR relevant to your issues. And tell us what you know about that recommendation.
Sure, that was a recommendation given by the government of Uruguay, actually, and it was a joint recommendation about addressing violence against LGBTQ populations and people in the sex trade, and it was accepted in full after a great deal of lobbying.
That's great. And if you look over the recommendations from 2010 and your issue wasn't raised or you had a recommendation the United States government didn't accept, don't worry about that because you can still participate in the UPR, but you do want to look at the last UPR to see whether there is anything you can talk about in terms of accepted recommendations. You may also want to talk about rejected recommendations, and you may also want to think about those rejected recommendations in terms of what strategies you want to use this time around. Let's move on to the next slide. The next step, we're still on step 4, is reviewing the procedural history with other human rights mechanisms. So you may want to look at whether there was a UN special procedure that conducted a country visit to the United States. I know the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women visited the United States, I think, in the past 4 or 5 years. So you'll want to look at her report to see whether she mentions any issues of concern and look to see whether there are any other special procedures that have visited the United States and done country reports after those visits, and of course looking at the concluding observations and lists of issues from the treaty bodies. That's also relevant. You shouldn't include that information, or it shouldn't necessarily feel like you need to include that information in your stakeholder report. It's already going to be included in a separate report by the OHCHR staff, but it's helpful to have that context, to know what other UN mechanisms have had to say about your issues. So, Kate, do you happen to know whether there's anything coming out of the other treaty bodies or out of special procedures about your issues?
You know, this is one of the things that actually makes it a little bit challenging is we definitely have had mentions of people of the sex trade. Unfortunately, the way that it is phrased oftentimes, especially as violence against women and with special report on trafficking, the way those have played out have actually been incredible contributions to to violence against people in the sex trade. But it was also something that was brought up during CERT.
Great, and it's really helpful, especially if you're dealing with an issue where there may be some division in the human rights community or there may be different perspectives on it. It's really helpful to get that context so you can avoid creating further problems through the UPR. You can think about, okay, this is how some countries might view, some countries may be completely aligned with how the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women views the issue, and you may keep that in mind in terms of your strategies for your lobbying and what kind of recommendations you would want. For example, my understanding is that the CEDAW committee in some instances doesn't use the word sex work or sex trade. They use the phrase women living in prostitution, and so there are some people in the human rights community who are abolitionists with respect to the sex trade, and so getting that context can be really helpful for how you want to frame your advocacy. Do you have any questions about any of that, Kate? or any additions to the discussion?
No, just that it was definitely brought up during CETA, and it's something that we're really struggling with as far as how to reference those, especially when they have had so many both unintended and intended consequences.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next slide. For reviewing the procedural history, this is just, if we've seen this slide before, but I've highlighted where to find the report of the working group and the addendum that we just mentioned for that procedural history for the United States and the UPR. Then we'll go to the next slide. Next is clarifying your role. Now remember, what they want for UPR stakeholder reports is firsthand information. And your organization, can shed more light on the rights and the related issues. You may have on-the-ground information, firsthand accounts of people who are directly affected by human rights violations. You may have reports or specialized knowledge, or you may have other information that you want to bring to light in your UPR report. So Kate, tell me about you and your the allied organizations. What kind of information do you have that can shed more light on the rights and related issues?
Most of the organizations that we're reaching out with really do deal directly with the population. They are peer and constituency-led organizations. And so we definitely have specialized knowledge of the impact of being in the sex trade. We have on-the-ground information, and we're calling a lot of first-hand accounts from different people who actually may or may not even be involved in our organization. As of late, we've been really using this not just as a tool to reach out to other organizations, but people who aren't necessarily affiliated with our SWAP here in New York City. And it's actually been a really incredible tool for a lot of folks who either don't necessarily have an interest in ongoing community building, but have experienced violence and do want to connect around the issue of violence and support. And so we've been using it to reach out to those folks and to be able to say, yes, we want your story and we want you to participate. And if, in addition, we also offer these services and have been able to connect folks to resources who haven't previously been involved in our organization.
That's great. It sounds like you're getting extra bang for your buck then by doing this research, doing this outreach, and getting these first-hand accounts. You're also able to connect in other ways with people you want to work with. Great. Let's go on to the next slide. At step 6, you want to, and this is really important for the UPR process in particular, is setting goals. Remember, we talked about that interactive dialogue with the state delegation. So a U.S. government delegation is going to go to Geneva, and then all of the countries in the world, all of the other countries in the world will have a chance to ask questions, to make comments, and most important, for purposes of the UPR, make recommendations. You remember Kate said the government of Uruguay last UPR specifically made a recommendation having to do with violence targeting LGBT people and targeting people who are in the sex trade. So those recommendations, that's really the critical component of this interactive dialogue, because it's the recommendations and the recommendations only that the U.S. government has to give the thumbs up, thumbs down. We accept these recommendations, we reject these other recommendations. So that's really important to think about what recommendations you would like to have coming out of the UPR process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that going on to the next slide. And I wanted to give you an example of a current recommendation, one from 2014, and because the Advocates for Human Rights does some advocacy about human rights in Ethiopia, I thought I'd share what the statement was for the United States during the UPR of Ethiopia in May of this year. And bear in mind that each government gets maybe 60 seconds, maybe 90 seconds to say everything. And if you look at this statement, this is all the U.S. government delegates said during the UPR, and that's all they had time for. A lot of what they say is sort of diplomat speak. We commend them for this, we praise them for this, but we're concerned about this, we're concerned about this. The real outcome, though, is those 1, 2, and 3 points at the bottom. We recommend that the Ethiopian government do these 3 things. Those are the things that go into the report of the working group. Those are the things the government of Ethiopia says, we agree to do this, we disagree, we won't do this. Those are the things the government accepts or rejects. And you'll see they're quite brief. There's not a lot of time for the delegates to get into all sorts of detail about things. And so that's something to think about when you try to, as an organization, formulate your proposed recommendations. what's feasible for a delegate to say in their 60 seconds? What would be something that would be succinct but also really helpful if the U.S. government accepted it? So let's look at another example of recommendations. We'll go on to the next slide. This is an example, again, from the UPR of Ethiopia earlier this year, and this is Thailand. Thailand commends positive steps. We applaud, blah, 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 blah. And then you get in the second paragraph, Thailand recommends Ethiopia to continue work for full implementation of its Human Rights Action Plan. And then in the last paragraph, Thailand recommends that Ethiopia consider adopting universal health care coverage. Those are pretty soft asks. Consider adopting something, continue to work on implementing something. Those are fairly weak, and you won't be surprised to know that the government of Ethiopia accepted those recommendations from Thailand. But if you look at the U.S. recommendations, one was to repeal a law, and the government of Ethiopia said, no, we won't repeal a law. So think about sort of hard, aggressive recommendations you might want to push for, and what might be a recommendation that would be more likely to make it through, but also might not have the same amount of impact. I would guess, it's great that the government of Ethiopia accepted these recommendations, but it's going to be hard in 4.5 years' time to say, well, has the government of Ethiopia made progress? Well, yes, we considered adopting healthcare coverage. So those are things to think about as you think about your recommendations. And those statements are then just taken verbatim and pasted into the report of the working group. So we'll go into the next slide. And this is the report of the working group from Ethiopia, and those are the just repeated verbatim what recommendations were made. But they're just taken directly from those statements that are made during the interactive dialogue, and then it's that language, specifically unedited, that the government that's being reviewed has to say thumbs up or thumbs down. And as it turns out, all the U.S. recommendations on the left were rejected. The recommendation on the right, the top one, was accepted, continue to work on the full implementation of the Human Rights Plan. And the one about healthcare, the government of Ethiopia said it wanted more time to think about it, and it'll be responding next month in the final part of the UPR with its final decision on that one. We'll go on to the next slide. Think about you've probably heard in terms of setting goals about making SMART goals, and you can think about recommendations in the same way. A helpful recommendation may be specific, measurable, attainable, and realistic, and it's important to think about realistic in terms of what realistically would the U.S. government accept. So the Advocates for Human Rights does advocacy on the death penalty, and we may want to push the diplomats in the UPR process to recommend that the United States abolish the death penalty. But it's not really realistic that our federal government would agree to do that, because our federal government doesn't see it being within its power. We might think about a recommendation that would have the federal government ensure that people who are being subjected to the death penalty have full access to information about the drugs that are being used to execute them. That could be, or that the FDA, that all the drugs used in executions be subject to FDA regulations. Those might be more realistic to the extent that we'd get the U.S. government to agree to them, or if the U.S. government didn't agree, it could end up being it's something that we could still use in our advocacy. That sometimes you can use a negative response as part of your advocacy to highlight an extreme position your government is taking. And in terms of being time-bound, SMART goals are supposed to be time-bound, but here we have the UPR, and it already has its time structure. So we have a process that repeats every 4.5 years. Let's go on to the next slide. If you want to look at other recommendations, there's a website here, the UPR Info database, and you can search this database for recommendations made by particular governments, made to the United States or to other governments, and you can search by keywords. So Kate, when I learned we were going to be doing this presentation, I did a keyword search to try to find out whether any recommendations have used the phrase sex work, because I know that that's contentious in the human rights community, and that's how I found Uruguay's recommendation to the United States, because they use that phrase. And also, in the context of the review of Thailand, the government of Finland also used the term sex work. And that may also get you thinking, you look at what those recommendations say, and get you thinking about which countries you might want to lobby. So for any of you who want some ideas for recommendations to focus on, you may want to take a look at this database. So Kate, I've been talking a lot about recommendations. Have you given any consideration to what recommendations might want to push for?
We're kind of crafting that right now and trying to figure out what our most strategic goals are. And so what we're doing is, like I said, we're really focusing on violence, trying to bring that up because they did commit 5 years ago to addressing violence against people in the sex trade, and then trying to craft something that is a little more specific and would fit within going back to Uruguay, but also seeing, you know, what other countries might actually be willing to discuss this issue in the way that we want to phrase it.
Mm-hmm. And you might want to think, for example, if Uruguay's recommendation was good, but it wasn't implemented and things have actually gotten worse since that recommendation was accepted, you might want to think about what could make it better. Maybe you want a recommendation similar to Uruguay's, but have the recommendation say collaborate with civil society organizations that work directly with people in the sex trade to do blah, 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 whatever it was that Uruguay said. And that way, if the U.S. government commits to that, then you get to, the next day, you get to go to the government and say, all right, you agreed to collaborate with us, here we are, and here's what we want to do, and so on. So that could be really helpful for your advocacy. Let's go on to the next slide. Step 7 is making and implementing a work plan, connecting steps 5 and 6, what information you have to bear and what recommendations you want to come out of the review. So think about those recommendations and think about what information you can get on the ground that would help provide support for those recommendations. Gather your information, consider the credibility and relevance of your sources, make sure they're recent, and keep in mind that this report is sort of a placeholder because you're going to be doing lobbying later on in 2015. You may want the report to cover a broader range of issues, and then when it comes time to lobby, you may want to have specially tailored one-pagers to target different delegations on different issues or different areas of focus. If there's a government like Thailand that doesn't generally do very toothy recommendations, maybe you want to have sort of a softer advocacy piece that would be a helpful set of recommendations, but that would be sort of aligned with what you would come to expect from Thailand. And with a different government like Uruguay or Finland, you may be able to have something more aggressive and really more specific. And also keep in mind that you and your partner organizations might want to use the report beyond the UPR for doing other advocacy or community education, et cetera. So, Kate, do you have a work plan in place for your stakeholder report?
We don't have a third one in place right now. The last time around, we had a stakeholder report that served a lot of us, and we were able to give it to a lot of different partners and networks and allies around the specific issues that were brought up, and so have really been able to utilize that report in the 5 years since to do a lot of work on top of that. And so this time we're kind of crafting it a little bit differently. We're going to do the initial report, and we're probably going to do some one-pagers on really specific issues, detailing, bringing out violence, discussing, not only the issue itself, but how it's changed in the last 5 years and how the government has really failed to live up to that standard. And then beyond that, do you need to talk about some of the lobbying that happened last time, or would you like me to save that?
We'll save that for, there's another step where we'll talk about that lobbying. But yeah, anything more you want to add on this piece though?
No, we're going to really utilize the report and see what comes out. We're still information gathering right now, and so we have an idea of what the generative themes are going to be. But based on that, I think the one-pagers are really going to target issues of violence, but expanding that into what are some of the root causes that we really want to tackle that are perpetuating this experience of violence.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide.
Dominique? I'll see you
Okay,
later.
so
I'm heading out. Yes, I have
the person who said see you later, I'm heading out, we can all hear you.
Exactly. That's the one. That was the first thing I figured. I was like, I'm getting the liquor. Take care.
All right, we're on step 8, writing the report. You're going to set up a writing team, take the information that you've gathered in the previous steps, and be sure to incorporate your proposed recommendations. One of the rules is don't use manifestly abusive language, and you don't need to discuss the procedural history about the concluding observations, treaty ratifications, etc. It's actually the OHCHR staff says, please don't include that information because we have it covered. They'll already be talking about it. So you have a writing team in place, Kate, is that right? Kate? Kate, did we lose you? Well, in the interest of time, let's move forward to the next slide. Next is finalizing and submitting your report. You want to know and meet your deadlines. Remember, September 15th, 11:59 Geneva time, p.m. Use the online submission system, and you can be showed that talks about the online registration page. You just click the registration link over on the right to register your organization. You can do that now, and then later you come back with your registration information and you upload your report. It's a fairly simple process, but that's the starting point for it. Let's go on to the next slide. And the next slide is advocacy with those diplomats from all of the other countries that are members of the United Nations. You'll also potentially be doing advocacy after the recommendations are made, advocacy with the U.S. government to get the U.S. government to accept recommendations. And then another part of advocacy is advocacy for implementation of any accepted recommendations. You may also want to do advocacy as part of your longer-term social justice advocacy using the report as a tool for education and outreach, as Kate suggested. Now, Kate, you had to do some advocacy to persuade the U.S. government to accept that recommendation from Uruguay. If you're still on the line, can you talk a little bit about that? Well, I'm not hearing Kate, but rest assured that she told me when we were preparing for this call that she and her organizations were involved in that advocacy to try to persuade the U.S. government to accept the recommendation from Uruguay. And so that's an important part of the UPR process is to do that. Let's move on to the next slide. Some best practices for stakeholder reports. Frame your issue. Use your recommendations to frame your arguments and organize your report. You can also say, here's the government's position, or here's what the law says, and then here's what's really going on. What's that firsthand information? You can use examples to highlight problems about gaps in the law or barriers to implementation. Footnote all of your sources, including your interviews and information you receive via email. Try to avoid any lengthy procedural history, lengthy discussion of the substance of particular rights, lengthy legal analysis, the tone of a legal brief, or vague recommendations. Remember, your audience in this case isn't human rights experts. It's diplomats. And so keep in mind your audience as you're drafting your report. Let's go on to the next slide. And now we're up for questions, and I'm hoping Josh is on the line with us as well. And there have been some great questions submitted via chat, so I don't know if Rebecca or somebody is going to throw those at us so everyone can see and hear them.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
So thank you so much, Amy and Kate, and thanks, Amy, for taking the lead while we had technical difficulties, and thank you, everyone, for staying on the line. So why don't I go ahead and just ask a few of these questions on the side, and then we'll allow people to also be able to ask questions. So you can either type your question in at the side, raise your hand function, which I'll make sure is working so that people can raise their hand in the My Mood function, or if you're listening on your phone, you should be able to unmute your phone to ask questions or type them on the side. So the first question, sorry, scrolling up, it was at the beginning, is from, let's see, Kay. And Kay asks, is it helpful to have individuals who are experts sign on along with allied organizations? And the second part of her question is it helpful to get foreign organizations to sign on as well as U.S.? So I don't know, Amy or Josh or Kate, if you're back on the line, if one of you want to take a stab at that.
Sorry, this is Kate. I am back on the line. I apologize very much. And what I was trying to say earlier was during our process of trying to get the the recommendation accepted by the U.S. government, we used media outreach to speak to the public. We had a policy recommendation that was several pages about violence against people in the sex trade, but we also had a sign-on letter that was that not only garnered support from the U.S. organizations who'd helped us write the original report, but we were able to outreach to a number of organizations internationally who focus on the issue to sign on to that letter and use that not only to get the U.S. government to accept it, but it was also really helpful in coalition building internationally to do follow-up work after that. And actually, one of the organizations that signed on emailed us later and said that because of the outreach that we had done and seeing what we had done, they had decided to participate in their UPR process as well.
Great. Well, you came back on at a perfect time, Kate, and thank you for answering that question. I don't know, Amy or Josh, if you have anything else to add to that. No? Okay. So then I'll move on to the next question typed in here. And please, everyone, feel free to type in your questions. And I apologize. It seems like the raise your hand function might not be working, so you may just have to go ahead and type in your questions. Or if you're on your phone, I believe you can press *6 to unmute yourself to ask a question. So Faraz asked, are NGOs of the same state as the state under review allowed to take the floor and make recommendations? Amy or Joshua or Kate, if you're there, do one of you want to answer that? Are we losing everyone?
I'm here. I just don't know.
Amy, are you there? Joshua? So we seem to have lost our presenters again, and I apologize for that. And sorry, is somebody else back on the line? And I apologize for the background noise right now. There's some sirens going off in New York. I'm actually not positive about the answer to that one, but what we can do is we don't have anybody else on. We can take all these questions, and those that we're not able to answer, we can let all the registrants of the webinar know what the answers are later.
Rebecca, can you hear me? This is Lori Graham. I teach international law at Suffolk University. So I just can quickly answer that. My understanding is no. So it's just it's a political process. It's just the individual members of states that can make recommendations.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lori, for taking part in our webinar and for answering that question.
No problem.
And again, everyone, I apologize for the sirens in the background. Okay. Joshua or Amy or Kate or any of you back on the line and able to answer questions?
This is Kate. I am. I'm not sure how helpful I'll be there.
Okay. So somebody asked a question. Jocelyn from Berkeley.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, Joshua. Great. Yes, we can hear you. Joshua, did you have anything else to add to that answer?
Yeah, the computer wasn't working for some reason, so I pulled out a phone.
Wonderful.
And let technology stop us. The one thing to say is about that question is, we don't get to speak. That's why the points that Amy brought up were so important. We write the report, and that's why reports are crucial, because that gives the information for the states to be able to ask all the questions. But one point when we get to speak is really at the end at the adoption. 10 NGOs will get 2 minutes each. So a lot of the 10 points that Amy discussed, the 10 steps, the speaking that we do is really in the preparation and the interaction. But during the actual consideration for 3.5, we're not speaking. But we've given them all the information. And then as Amy spoke about, in those 60 seconds they have, the 90 seconds, they're going to say what we prepared for them and educated them on.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. So I think I'll go ahead and ask the next question on the side. And the next question is, if you can make it, one question I have is the report can draw from all the human rights treaties or just the ones that the U.S. has ratified? And I believe Amy answered that question in her presentation, that you can draw from all treaties, not just the ones that the U.S. has ratified for your report. Then we have another question from Britain, who asked, do you have any specific advice on converting a shadow report and a stakeholder report for those of us who have recently submitted shadow reports for the ICCPR or STIR reviews? Joshua, do you want to answer that question, or Amy, if you're back on?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. What we're trying to share with all the other task force, the exciting thing is, if we look at our report of what we have to write by September 15th, we already have done 75% of it. The ICCPR Human Rights Committee, that was in March. So what we can do is take those reports. You can see if your working group is represented in the 19 working groups of the UPR. And if it's not, you can just update and provide more late first-hand accounts, as was brought up by Amy, and then you can submit that. So the good thing about the UPR is it gives everyone a chance to talk about the issues that they wanted to talk about on the treaty bodies, but maybe it didn't get enough attention. And the same is also for CERD. We had a debrief, and many people said they wish other things were included. So if you didn't feel you got everything you were hoping for out of CERD, that's another 25%. That right there already makes us having half of our reports ready. And is, of course, CAP, which is due on September 17th. So you could just really take some points that you might thought you were stretching to fit under CAT, and you don't have to try to stretch it, because under the UPR, it's anything in the UN Charter and also anything in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so it's a little more broad, and also international humanitarian law. And then finally, our 25%. And that's the important part of the UPR, is we really don't focus on economic, social, and cultural rights enough in the other three mechanisms that we ratified. So we really highlight those during this part. So anyone that did do one of those stakeholder reports for the other committees, you can just make it a little better and more current, and then release that for the UPR.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua, for answering that. And then the next question I see here is, how specific should first-hand information be? I am helping write a report on human rights education, so I'm wondering if we should be including specific examples of schools implementing human rights curriculum or such examples. Joshua, do you also want to answer that one?
Sure. I think that goes along with the SMART recommendation that she talked about. So, yeah, the best and most recent first-hand information that gives a reason of why a question should be asked or a recommendation to be posed to the U.S. government is really the best. And especially with human rights education, and the only thing I was going to be sensitive about is, you know, if you're a human rights defender and you're worried about reprisals or things like that, you might not want to include things that, you know, would allow your identity to be known. But definitely for human rights education, I think as you can make that SMART example specific and measurable and describe those things, because what we're trying to do is tell these other governments and explain to them what we face on a first-hand basis and how their recommendation would actually change our daily living and improve the situation here on human rights on the ground.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua. So there's a question here from Francis, and it says, in the last webinar about shadow reports, I thought you said that there was a luncheon where we could talk with commissioners. Now you're saying we don't get to talk. What is the relationship? And so I think, for instance, what you're talking about is our last webinar that we had right before the third review, which just took place last week. And that's a bit of a different treaty body. As we spoke about before, those are people who are part of the committee, and we were able to have an informal breakfast briefing with them before the review. But as we've mentioned, the people who are involved with the Universal Periodic Review are representatives of the state. But I don't know, Joshua or anyone else, if you want to try to answer that as well.
No, I think, Rebecca, you got it right. The most important thing is this is how the UPR is different, that you're really speaking to governments and diplomats, and they'll be speaking on our behalf. And the similar thing is with the treaty bodies, you speak to the experts and educate them, and then they act on our behalf. So we're always doing advocacy to explain our position, and other people are speaking. So some of the exciting things is we still get to do side events like we did at CERD, and we'll be planning those at UPR as well. And that's where we can speak and share firsthand what's going on.
So Amy also types, because she's having technical difficulties with the phone, that in your lobbying you get to try to set up meetings to speak one-on-one with diplomats from other governments. So similar, that's the point when you get to speak. And I apologize that folks aren't able to raise their hands with the webinar right now. And a lot of people aren't able to ask questions by phone. So if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to type them on the side. Also, if you can't think of a question right now, you can also submit a question at any time to upr@ushnetwork.org, and we're happy to answer any follow-up questions then. But I see another question just came in from Adam, and Adam asks, what are the questions submitted in advance? When are those posed, and how does the U.S. reply to them? Joshua, would you like to answer that one as well?
What some states do is they send a list of questions, and the U.S. government has those before, and they can comment on those. And that kind of fits into our strategy on advocacy. And we don't want to get people too focused on that yet until we finish reports, because we know there's been so many reports that are due in the past couple months. But once we submit our report, really from September 15th on, we can set up meetings, really in October, November, January, February, probably at the latest, in Geneva, but also in Washington, D.C., and also in even New York. We get 3 chances to kind of have forums where we can educate the missions and the embassies about our most important human rights issues. And then usually probably 2 months out is the deadline for those countries that are that prepared, and they actually will send some advanced questions for the U.S. government to answer.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. And I see here another question from Elizabeth, who asked, what format is used to submit sign-on organizations? And Elizabeth, we have a link on our website, on our UPR page, which is a template for shadow report writing, and you should see there, there's not, a specific format. You just need to have the organizations who want to sign on to your shadow report also add their name to the report. And then I think we have one last question here from Faraz. And Faraz, I'm sorry, I apologize if I'm not getting your question correct, but it says, what is the best, maybe perhaps way, it says, what is the best way to present our report to other diplomats in order to encourage them to make the recommendations we wish to see presented? Joshua, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, it's on the last one, and on this one. Yes, that I thought Amy brought up really well. What you do is you take your 5-page or 10-page report that you submit, and then you really break it down to a 1 to 2 pager, where you just put the issue, then what question specifically you want to be posed to the United States, and then finally the recommendations. And using those smart things of making it measurable and timely is absolutely crucial. And so if you do 1 to 2 pagers, that's your tool that you talk to governments. And most governments, if they're interested, you also use the UPR info to match your issue with what country asked those questions. And they'll look at your 1 to 2 pager when you meet with them, and they'll appreciate it. And if they need background information or more, they'll be able to go to the OHCHR website where your working group reports will have been submitted.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. And Amy added a bit of an answer you may have all seen on the side in the chat function about having sign-ons. And she said that you can just add their names to your report, and if they come in later, the sign-ons after the September 15th deadline, you can add them to an updated version of your report. But you won't be able to submit that formally to the UN. That system does close on September 15th at 11:59 p.m. Geneva time, but you can use it in your advocacy and lobbying, those extra sign-ons. I don't see any other questions at this time. I have a few follow-up things, but Joshua, I don't know if you want to add any concluding remarks before we just do the next steps and then close out the webinar.
No, the main thing I just want to encourage everyone is to definitely realize the opportunity we have with the UPR. Maybe reach out more in your community and people that maybe weren't able to get involved in CERD or in the Human Rights Committee, and just let them know that this UPR is really all-encompassing and allows a lot of people to participate on a lot of different issues, and it's the most broad mandate, so it's a lot of way to bring in and grow our human rights family here and the movement in the United States.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. And I think we have one final question, if you don't mind helping answer it. Elizabeth asked, and she went ahead already and ran the quick search on the subject matter for her submissions, as Amy recommended. I'm sorry, if you're on the line, could you please mute your phone? And she says that she has hundreds of countries made comments related to her subject matter, and she's asking if she should note this in her submission.
No. Because the truth is the other report that the High Commissioner for Human Rights puts will actually look at other previous UPRs and things like that. That's really valuable for the last question, where she knows now which governments to meet with to ask to raise the question on her behalf.
Okay.
So, and that's great.
Great.
It's much better to have more countries interested than less.
Wonderful. Thanks, Joshua, for answering that, and thank you, Elizabeth, for asking, and Amy also for adding to that on the side. So I think right now I'm going to go ahead and just show you. You can see I have a slide up now with a list of UPR resources. I have the URL to our U.S. Human Rights Network UPR page, and up there you'll see the template that we've created for putting together a stakeholder report. So I recommend that you all, if you're planning to put together a report, go there right now and take a look at that and start writing. There's also the civil society, the OHCHR Civil Society guidelines. There's a webinar on why and how to engage with the UPR. That was the last webinar. There's the 10 steps to writing a UPR stakeholder report, which we largely went over in this webinar. And then there is a link to engaging the U.S. government through UN advocacy and human rights compliance. And that was a civil society consultation that took place at American University. So all of these, you can click on these links now, I believe, but all of these resources are also up on our UPR website. And one thing I just want to make sure to reiterate for everyone, if you have a particular interest and you're looking to work with other people to put together a report with some other folks working on your issue, and you haven't been able to find those folks, feel free to reach out to us at the network at upr@ushrnetwork.org. And don't forget that the deadline for submitting a shadow report is September 15th, and that's has to be done by 11:59 Geneva time, which I'm happy that Amy pointed out. For us here on the East Coast, Geneva is 6 hours ahead of time. So really, you should be submitting your reports probably to be safe by September 14th at the latest. And then the U.S. Human Rights Network also puts together an executive summary that we will submit by September 15th. And if you want your information to be included in that, then please submit it to us by September 15th. And that can also be emailed to the UPR at USHR. I'm sorry, September 5th. Thank you, Joshua. Not September 15th. Otherwise, it won't get in. Please, September 5th. at upr@ushrnetwork.org. And if you're not already on the UPR listserv, I recommend you joining it now. There's a really short link right here because we continue to post information there on how to stay involved and other important information about the UPR. And last but not least, it's love to become a member of the network. So thank you so much to our presenters, to Amy and to Kate and to Joshua and to the whole UPR task force, and for everyone who attended and for staying on the line throughout all the technical difficulties. A recording of this webinar will be posted shortly and will be on our website, which will include a copy of all of the slides. So thank you very much, and we look forward to working with all of you on your UPR advocacy and reports. Have a good day, everyone.
Aloha. Bye.